in Ukraine. We're going to talk about mass housing in Ukraine, past and future of building typologies. There's going to be lectures by Philipp Meuser and Kate Malaia. Kateryna Malaia. Today, Kate. I'll tell you more about this in a few minutes when we officially start. Warm welcome to a few new guests. I see the amount of participants rising. And also we are live on Facebook streaming. This lecture is organized by Ro3kvit. Ro3kvit is a new initiative. It's a coalition for Ukraine. We talk about urban planning, housing, and development of the reconstruction of Ukraine during the war and after the war. This is our third lecture, and we do have a lecture every 2 weeks on Thursday, 7 o'clock Ukrainian time. Today, it's about mass housing in Ukraine, past and future building typologies, and it will not only look into history, but also into the future of modernization of Ukraine. I'm not going to tell all about it because Philipp and Kate will take us by the hand, and they will lead us through all their research that have been done. Philipp has done research in prefabricated housing with a special focus on former Soviet republics. It's a very, very big honor, Philipp Meuser, to have you here. You're a practicing architect, you have done a PhD, and you're also a head of a publishing house called Dom Publishers. And this total picture gives us a huge perspective on this specific topic. Thank you. After that, there will be Kate Malaia. She's originally from Ukraine, did their bachelor and master degree, but did a PhD in the United States. And much of the research has been done about Ukrainian typologies, about Soviet Union typologies of houses. And it's an honor to have you here because you've written a book which will be published in 2023. So we have to wait a little bit about this topic. But now, probably today, you will already give some information what is in this book to this audience. And I'm very pleased to have you here as well. Okay, I think we just start. Mass housing in Ukraine, we do it like this. We talk in English today. Sometimes it's English and Ukrainian. If people have a question, always put it in the chat and we will repeat it. You can put it in the chat in both English and Ukrainian. And please feel free to join the discussion. First, we have the talk by Philipp, and then by Kate, and then we have a public discussion together. But feel free to put your questions or your remarks in the chat during the whole lecture, and maybe I will pick one of those comments out already in between. Philipp, I think the word is for you.
Cool. Thank you very much. And just starting with the first slide. I hope everyone can see the full screen. If not, please let me know. Mass housing in Ukraine, the past and the future of building typologies. Kateryna, Malaia, and we just met recently in a conference in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and very soon we found out that our research subjects are matching somehow. And since I have been planning to do a kind of study on the typology of mass housing or on housing in general in Ukraine, so we thought it might make sense to join and to start with a the research, and we are proud. Kateryna, you allow me to say that we are proud to present the first draft of what we are hiding for and going for in this lecture. So the objectives of our research, it's not a surprise, just gathering knowledge about the history of mass housing in Ukraine, and we do that not only as architectural historians, but we understand ourselves to provide the basis for the rebuilding of Ukraine and the reconstruction for the urban infrastructure. So this research and this lecture might give all stakeholders a first idea of what is needed when we talk about the rebuilding of Ukraine, and when we are talking also about a new structure of the housing market, the real estate market in Ukraine. So what are the potentials and the challenges? So it's also with an academic approach, of course, to identify the independent development of housing within the USSR, as we know that from other former Soviet republics. So we're also heading for to rise a cultural awareness of interwar architecture in Kharkiv and in Lviv. And as we know, completely different history when we talk about this interwar period. And as Fulko already mentioned, so we're not looking to the past, but also looking to the future and try to define potentials for mass housing in future in Ukraine. And so we always try to use this CCC, community, circular, climate-friendly planning for the future. And what has this to do with the Soviet mass housing or with the history of housing in Ukraine? We will let you know.
And I think just to second what Philip is saying, the essential principle behind what we're doing, besides studying the housing that exists in Ukraine, is also a sense that there is so much Soviet-built housing in Ukraine. And now there's also so much damaged housing in Ukraine that there will have to be, obviously, there will have to be some reconstruction effort. But at the same time, since we all have to think about climate-friendly and ecologically aware architecture these days, this is the most important trend in architectural thinking around the world, right? We also have to understand that the greenest building, that the most ecologically friendly building is a building that's already built. And even the damaged buildings will have to be recycled and rethought somehow in the process of reconstruction. So we're trying, instead of just thinking of wiping everything damaged out, we're trying to think of what can be used, what can be recycled, what can be rethought in the process of reconstruction. And the methods that we are employing in our research, particularly the sources that we're going to be looking at, are of course primary sources, so archival materials in various Ukrainian cities. We already know that we can use archives that exist in Lviv, archives that exist in Kiev. We would love to use archives that are hopefully still intact in Kharkiv, but of course that's considering the current situation, that would be considerably more difficult, but we will try our best. We would also love to use the so-called SNIPs, or in Ukrainian DBNs, Державні будівельні норми і правила, or state construction norms and regulations as our archival materials. We would love to use secondary sources, particularly Soviet and post-Soviet books, magazines, and such. And this is essential to what we're doing with our research on war damage. We will use publicly available media content, such as photographs on social networks, news, and such, to determine which buildings have been damaged and how. And thank you, Philip. The other important moment with these publicly available media is that not everything is quite obvious or straightforward, and some of these publicly available media are actually propaganda or being used as propaganda. So we will have to carefully sift we will have to carefully look through what's available and how it's being used and try to, I suppose, establish justice for some of the images that are being used in propaganda purposes by Russians.
So the focus of our research, architecture, civil engineering, prefabrication. So this is important to say because we know that from other academic colleagues, from other studies who have discussed and who have done some research on the mass housing phenomenon in former Soviet Union, but they avoided to mention architecture, civil engineering, prefabrication. So that's very, very important. But we also try to identify the potentials of rebuilding, reuse, and recycling, which might be, or we think, we are sure that we have a big potential when we talk about circular building, about ecological building, just to use what is available, not only the existing buildings in general, but also parts, damaged parts of deassembled buildings, what we need to know, which we need to find a new use for the building materials. When it comes to the object of our research, so we thought to focus on 3 periods. So the first period, experimental housing in the interwar period. I mentioned before the Polish part of the area around Lviv, Kharkiv as another focus, which was the then capital of the first capital of Soviet Ukraine. The second part will focus on the type housing series between Stalin and Glasnost, so what we call the type series. And of course, what is also important to mention and which should be also included in our focus is the housing in Ukraine since 1991.
So on the left, you see an example of interwar experimental housing that used some prefab elements, which I find to be absolutely fascinating. Those are one of the earliest prefab experiments in what today is unitary Ukraine. Back then, of course, the country was divided between the Soviets and the Polish and many others. So Lviv and Kharkiv, like Philip mentioned, would be 2 cities where we would pick examples to look at from the interwar period. Then we will look at the Soviet prefab throughout the years, which is not just Khrushchevkas, but plenty of different typologies that developed between the 1950s and all the way to 1991, and were even being built after 1991 sometimes. And then on the right, you see a pretty iconic image. This is a building from the 1990s called Khvila in Kiev by Yanushvili, or Volna. This building nicely represents what was being built in the first post-Soviet years, but we're also going to include examples of housing that is being currently, or not currently, but prior to the war, was being built in Ukraine, and those new trends and those new developments.
Just to give you an idea on how deep we are trying to give a structure, systematic into these typologies, I just pick out the second chapter, the Soviet mass housing, and just give you an idea about the generations. So from earlier studies, we know that the mass housing in the Soviet period between the late 50s till the late 90s plus into the 90s. So we know that there are different generations, and following this method to identify series and to systemize them into generations, it helps us to understand what is the potential for further use to reconstruction, the sense of remodeling them, but also to think about how we can recycle certain elements. And so we don't go too much into detail within this lecture, because this would be a complete different and own lecture. But just to give you an idea how you can find the difference between the generations. It's just the matter of size. So it's a size and scale. So the first generation, what we see on the left-hand side, this blue elements. So the type project were always planned and built with different sections, but only the smallest unit, what could be used within the urban grid, was a full house. So it was a full house, including different sections. And here we see 3 sections. They were more or less repeating each other. So the difference to the second generation in the center with these red elements was that the section itself was the smallest unit, and it was possible for the architects and for the urban planners to form new forms and shapes within the urban grid. And you see, you can always identify these microrayons of the second generation when you see when you look from Google or from satellite images. You see all these snakes and meanders going through the landscape. So this is always a kind of parameter to identify the second generation. When it comes to the third generation, the smallest planning unit was the apartment itself, and it was possible with like a Tetris game. You could stick all those apartments together. It's just very simplified, this system, just to understand that the elements became smaller and smaller, or the units became smaller and smaller. You can just to give you a kind of meta level, just to understand. So the first generation was as inflexible like a schachmat game, like this board. The second generation was kind of domino stones, what you could stick together, and the third generation a kind of Tetris where you could play like in a children's room to work on these third generations. And so our idea is also to continue the systematization within these generations. So we know that for the 1990s, the elements or the systems, the type series, the smallest unit became smaller and smaller. So it was called that a kind of Lego system. So when you have a catalog of elements like in Lego, and the architects were able to design quite creative and non-standard buildings based on standard elements. When it comes to the future of prefab housing, so we know that with the help of CAD and CNC, it's possible today to design anything. And with the help of the digitalization process, and BIM is also a term what might be interesting in this context. It is possible, like in a puzzle. So you have an idea, you have a design, and then with the help of digitalization, you just cut it in different puzzles. So we call the fifth generation kind of puzzle, which it gives you just an idea that we are not talking or just not trying to only use academic terms, but also try to make it more popular, to make our research more understandable.
So why are we talking about Soviet mass housing so much? The reason why we would like to talk about Soviet mass housing in the context of independent Ukraine is because there's still a lot of it, and it's pretty omnipresent. It's found in every Ukrainian city, practically every Ukrainian town. This one is just an illustration of the earlier mass housing series that were built in Ukraine. And if you can see, the cities mentioned there in this historic illustration are Mykolaiv, Zaporizhzhia, Kyiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Dnipro these days, Kherson, and Kerch. It covers the entire territory of Ukraine, any region, Crimea, Central Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine. Hence, it's simply necessary to address if we're talking about housing in Ukraine at all. So a couple of quotes on the state of housing and also on the state of the housing affairs in Ukraine prior to when the war started in February. According to State Statistics Committee, around 4.33 million square meters of housing in Ukraine are dilapidated at this point. And that includes old buildings that are not in a satisfactory state from all eras, starting from pre-1917 and 1919 housing all the way into the interwar housing, the 10,000 apartment buildings built between 1920 and then right after the war, 1953. And then when it comes to mass housing, 7,000 apartment buildings of the first Khrushchevka series and second generation Khrushchevka series, and then another 5,000 of buildings built between 1970s and 1989. When it comes to Kiev alone, according to some Kiev developers, particularly this one, rather notorious character, Lev Partshaladze, there are 11,000 multi-story apartment buildings in total, and out of those, 4,000 are first and second generation mass housing series and third generation mass housing series. Now, prior to the war, right before the war, there was a pretty widespread conversation about demolishing Khrushchevkas in Ukraine. It never got into practical stages. Generally speaking, in all post-Soviet republics, demolishing Khrushchevkas only got into an actual practical stage of demolition and resettlement in a couple of Russian cities, in Moscow, I believe, and maybe in St. Petersburg, but nowhere else. In Ukraine, that conversation was just starting to happen, and it wasn't an easy conversation because not everybody was necessarily willing to leave. There wasn't necessarily a coordinated, simple plan on how that was going to happen. And even the idea itself, taking all old Khrushchevkas down and building some new housing in its place, is also somewhat questionable, considering that those are older neighborhoods with some sort of established lifestyle, with old trees, and generally everything that comes with decades of normal neighborhood settlement. Now, with all of that, we would like to concentrate specifically for this lecture, we would like to concentrate specifically on the example of Kharkiv, since we know that Kharkiv had a lot of war damage already. Sadly, things are still happening and we don't know when they're going to stop. So it just seemed like a good example to look at. And within Kharkiv, to make this brief, we would like to concentrate on a specific series, since mass housing was designed in series, right? This is the one we picked for Kharkiv because it's absolutely omnipresent. It's 257. This particular series was not designed in Ukraine. It was actually designed by a Moscow Institute for Typal and Experimental Housing Design called MINITEP. But the series is found in Kharkiv so frequently that it seemed logical to talk about this one in this lecture. This series is also very easily recognizable by these slanted balconies. Philip, could you go to the next slide, please? So when we were looking at images of damage in these housing structures, 257 is the one that we were particularly able to identify very easily in the Kharkiv neighborhood of Saltivka. There are a lot of these buildings, many of them were damaged. What does that kind of information give us? So when we know the series of a building that has been damaged, we practically automatically know what kind of panels went into construction. We know what kind of apartment layouts exist inside of that building. This does not mean that we can absolutely predict the amount of structural damage that the structure has taken, or how much the load-bearing capacity of the panels is compromised. But at least we know the types of panels that were damaged, and we know the types of buildings that were damaged in every given neighborhood. Furthermore, with all these series, since all these, the entire concept of serial design and serial building of apartment buildings is that they're all identical, at least when it comes to plans. Because we know the series type, we automatically know what's inside of the building. or at least we know which walls are load-bearing, which ones are not load-bearing. This particular image comes from a catalog of series that Moscow Institute for Type and Experimental Design released themselves to indicate which walls were okay to touch in the buildings that they designed back during the Soviet years, and which walls are not okay to touch. So partition walls in this case are marked in white, and load-bearing elements are marked in black. Another series that we wanted to look at is the series that has not been that damaged in Kharkiv, but is so omnipresent around Ukraine that it has clearly, unfortunately, we pretty much know that in Mariupol buildings like that were damaged. And buildings like that are also found pretty much anywhere in Ukraine. And this is also a Ukrainian design series. So what exactly do we mean by Ukrainian design series? The entire Soviet system of serial design functioned based on institutes. There were some central organizations in Moscow, the Central Experimental Institute for Housing Design, SNEP, that one, after 1963, mostly approved projects that came from specific regions. And there were also regional design institutes. Regional design institutes were founded based on different climate zones. Ukraine was climate zone 3, according to the Soviet system of climate zones. So Ukraine ended up with its own housing design institute in Kyiv, called Kyiv SNEP. Tashkent also had its own institute, the capital of Uzbekistan, and Tbilisi, Georgia, had its own design institute. What ended up happening is the result, all of these local zonal, so-called zonal institutes developed their own series. They were similar to series elsewhere, but they had their own specifics. And oftentimes, like with 1480, these series were first developed early in the 50s, and then gradually the design institutes just kept building up and up and up, taking these series further. So 480 is one of the biggest families of series throughout the USSR, the former USSR, and in Ukraine in particular. And it was built in a number of modifications in 5 stories, 9 stories, 10 stories, out of different materials with different floor plan combinations, dependent on a particular city in Ukraine. These are just some of the cities. I don't know if you can see, it might be a little too small on this slide, but the cities that are mentioned here are Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, let's see, yeah, that sounds about right. And there are plenty of Kyiv and plenty of them in Mariupol. Depending on the type of the city, like I said, they would differ. Oftentimes, materials would be local. So for example, in Donetsk and Luhansk, the materials used for this series to be developed would be slag concrete blocks because there was plenty of slag. Whether it's good or not, it's a different question because slag can be fairly radioactive. But that was the regional adaptation. And for these types of buildings, there would be different structural ideas happening based on the city and region. This is a later modification of the same 1480. So everything started with 5-story classic-looking Khrushchevkas, sometimes brick Khrushchevkas, brick block Khrushchevkas, so slightly better ones. They're considered slightly better. Then it went into a 9-story modification. Again, various different nomenclatures. The most famous one that was built all over Kyiv is 1 kg 480 12U. And the same exact thing with 11U. Those were some of the buildings that were oriented north to south or oriented east to west. But the same exact buildings were built throughout. This is perhaps one of the more important slides of this lecture. If we know a series, we know the specs and we know all of the details of how the panels were connected. We pretty much know everything about the structure of the building before we ever have 2 engineers on site checking for its structural integrity, or before we make any decisions on potential recycling or reuse. When it comes to 1480, we know that all of these series were pretty much built on 3 longitudinal load-bearing walls. We also know the exact dimensions for spans and clear spans. It would be 320 centimeters and it would be 482 centimeters. We know the exact floor heights. Depending on the year, they would be slightly different, but still we know them. If these buildings were built in coal mining regions, we also know that they had these ferric concrete belts built around each section in order to hold the building from deformations possible due to the grounds not being settled. We know all of the possible details of how the armature was welded together and how the armature was cast into each specific panel, thanks to the fact that all of these buildings were built in series. Just one more last example, or actually not the last one, but a good example of what happened with these buildings and what also matters. So I talked about the structural qualities and potential reuse that way, but there were also changes in the apartment plans that are important to understand before we make any decisions on reconstruction, demolition, reuse, preserving them, whatever it is. This is an apartment from 1447 series, a very typical series in Ukraine as well. So many buildings like that exist. What is shown here are the results of the remodeling or replanning, перепланування in Ukrainian, that were done in the 1990s. There existed more than 2 scenarios for Hrushevkas. Hrushevkas are generally kind of notorious for their small kitchens, walk-through rooms, all kinds of issues with the plan design that are quite explainable historically, but may not work very well in current conditions. Now, these two scenarios that I'm showing you here, these are perhaps the most widespread scenarios of remodeling that happened in the 1990s after the Soviet Union fell apart, namely either a partition wall between the kitchen and the living room was removed, or another wall was built to isolate the former walk-through room. Why were these remodelings possible? In Hrushevkas, partition walls were built from gypsum concrete, pretty firm, not load-bearing material. Nothing bad about it if it was manufactured correctly. The only problem was that if they were built that way, this kind of material was not available to consumers. So if consumers ever wanted to somehow relay their apartment, let's say the number of family members decreased or the number of family members increased, or they considered kitchen to be inconveniently small, they could not do so because none of these partition wall materials were easily available to consumers. The only thing that they could do was to construct a wall out of sheathing, something like dranka in Ukrainian. And if you can imagine, it's not very convenient to construct something like that. So what really changed in the 1990s is that drywall or dry gypsum boards became easily available to consumers in the post-Soviet construction markets. That meant that people could now take their old gypsum concrete partition walls that were originally built in their buildings and rethink their apartments completely however they wanted. Now, of course, that if you've ever been inside of those apartments, you know that sometimes it resulted in some questionable aesthetic solutions. However, that's not what matters to us. What matters to us is how exactly were people rethinking their spaces and how they were adjusting to this new post-1991 reality. Because of drywall, they were also able to do certain things that they haven't been able to do before, like curved walls. Just wasn't a thing. And now it became easily doable. On the right, in the right lower corner, you see a picture of the local Kyiv office of Kharkiv, a German corporation that produces drywall besides other things. Knauf had an incredible market in Ukraine. And it is a shame that Knauf publicly announced that they will not leave the Russian market. So the destiny of Knaf in Ukraine after the war is, unknown for now. So I wanted to finish this entire conversation about remodeling with showing you a couple of examples from 1-480 apartments and just explaining what exactly happened and why does it matter. First of all, in Khrushchevkas in the early series, storage was not necessarily sufficient for contemporary context. We all know that these days we own way more stuff than 50 years ago, hence we need more storage space. We also know that for these apartments, kitchens were small if you assumed that a larger family lived in them. Of course, if it's one person, then the kitchen might be sufficient size. But again, it depends on the idea of who populates these apartments. The image on the left is just from a real estate website, first real estate website I found, just to illustrate that these are very widespread apartments in Ukraine. Now, this version of replanning creates a scenario in which one or two people can have their isolated bedroom space. They can have their living room or some sort of workspace merged with the kitchen. That means that unlike in the Soviet apartment, where somebody always slept on the couch and somebody always walked past that person sleeping on the couch in the walk-through room when they needed to make it to that faraway bedroom, in this case, there's perfect privacy of sleep. There's control over one's sleep hours, sleep rhythms. There's more sound and insulation for this particular family or particular individual who lives in this space. This kind of replanning is very typical for smaller families. So if it was one person, or if somebody bought an apartment like that for themselves and for another person, that would be the typical way to go. This replanning, according to the Recorder of Deeds folks in Kiev, BTI in Kiev, is the most typical version of a replanning in a post-Soviet apartment. What this does, instead of a walk-through room, you now have two separate rooms, which means that two individuals, if they are from different generations, for example, a mother and a grown-up child, or a mother and a father and their grown-up child who brought back a partner, so virtually two nuclear families in one apartment now, they can all have their private space. They can all have their separate private bedrooms, and they add some extra storage at the end of that hallway that they create to separate these two rooms. All of these changes that have taken place in the mass-built apartments are now a part of that fabric. You cannot disregard these changes. You have to look at these plans in the way that they were modified, not just the way they were created.
So thanks so far to allow us to go so much into details and with this very detailed presentation. So of course we're focusing on architecture, we're focusing on construction systems, but this knowledge about the building system is so crucial if we talk about the future of housing, to talk about making decisions about demolishing or recycling, reusing. But we also, as architects, we also have a cultural aspect, and please allow us to quote this French philosopher Claude Lévi-Strauss who said, classification, even if it is uneven and arbitrary, preserve the richness and the diversity of what it drafts. By determining that everything should be taken into account, it facilitates the formation of a memory. So by giving a systematization to the long history of mass housing in Ukraine, so we would like to give a tool for all those who are involved in the process of reconstruction, of recycling and modernization of the housing market. But we also would like to contribute to a kind of building history, architecture history, and we feel that the history of residential buildings, of housing. The history of housing is always mainly marginalized in the architectural history, and we also would like to put that on the top level, giving it another priority when it comes to the history and the storytelling of the history of the 20th century and of course of the 21st century. So in the last part of our presentation, we would like to take you by the hand and just to show you how we are working, and we would also like to combine that with the call for cooperation. So whoever is interested in working with us, or who could add some information, please contact us and let us know about your family history, about your experience in living in some serious, to help identify some serious. So what Kateryna already mentioned, so primary sources, archives, needs are interesting for us.
And if I may add to that, some photographs of Khrushchevka and later series interiors. I've always found that to be the most difficult type of primary source to locate, people's archival photographs. If you would ever like to share, and if you would like your apartment's photograph to be featured in a publication, please do.
So it's not only the public archives or the state archives, it's also the family archives. When it comes to the secondary sources, books and magazines, I would assume we have quite a lot of the main and the most important literature available, but who knows, one of you has some hidden gems somewhere in the library. Please let us know. So we are very happy to gather all these materials, and it's not only about books from the Soviet time. So some of you know that we at Dom Publishers, we have been focusing very much on the history of Soviet architecture. Other publishers do also something like this. Please let us know. We are happy.
Yeah, I think Philip pretty much covered this subject. The journals, Строительство and Архитектура, Жилищное строительство, all of those Soviet journals, everything published by the Ukrainian Soviet publisher Будівельник back in the day. If you happen to have any of those books or magazines scanned and would like to share, please let us know. Although we may have them already, we would still take any scans that you may have.
So we understand our research also to sharpen our alts eyes. So of course, the media research, the daily news, every day we are flooded by new pictures on destroyed houses. It's not only the military camps or any military infrastructure. So we know that already. So it is also residential buildings, housing series, what we know from our academic circles, from our private biography. They are all damaged, or some of them are damaged. And we see these images every day. So on the left-hand side, some images from the New York Times. On the right-hand side, from some German news agencies. So we see how explosions occur, what happens to all these Ukrainian cities. But we do not only look to the Western sources, but we also allow ourselves to look to cities where Western news are not so much focusing on, because like in this case, Mariupol. So we know the access to Mariupol is very difficult. So we also have to look to sources like Sputnik Images, the state propaganda machine of today's Russia. And they also, this was quite surprising for us, they also show buildings or images of destroyed buildings. So we can assume that some of these buildings are also the series 148. But when we look closer, what are the images used for? So we read something, so we on the left-hand side, we see Khrushchevka, or it's a 5-store panel building. And the caption to this image says, okay, this is the place where the demining happens. So in the center, we see this is Prospect Mira, so the avenue with the name of peace in Mariupol. On the right-hand side, we see a complete damaged microrayon, and still the Russian news are still talking about the military operation, not from, they're not talking about a martial war. So we always have to be aware. So that's the reason why the trolls are always and everywhere. And we have to identify those information which are part of a troll factory, which are part of propaganda. And we have to exclude that from our scientific approach to only focus on architecture, engineering, and prefabrication. So what is also important, the private context, social media. I think all of us are currently or permanently in contact with friends and family members in Ukraine. So they exchange information. I just recently was informed that for example, of Kharkiv, so the city administration started a kind of index, so where the people could just give the information how damaged apartments are, or the whole residential buildings. So this is something which is also important for us. So we try to also identify buildings, and then going back to try to find out what is the series behind. And what we are also aiming for is that in the end, once we see sad images like this, partly destroyed buildings, but very soon we find out, or we see that this is the series 257, and who knows, in the neighboring microrayon, another 257 series is going to be demolished, and some parts or some panels might be recycled just to repair this building. Who knows? So we don't know that in the moment. So another example, sad images of destroyed buildings with death and terror. So we know all these pictures. So this will be also part of our research, part of our book, what we are going to publish. It's planned for spring next year. So it's just a very brief introduction to what we are thinking and what we are researching in the moment. And we also need to announce what's next. So when we talk about demolishing, when we talk about recycling, rebuilding, reuse. So in Germany, we have some examples or some experience also in how to recycle elements from prefabricated housing. As you probably know, in the early 2000 years, thousands of apartments were destroyed or disassembled in Germany due to the fact that they were just empty. So decreasing population in the eastern part of Germany brought big troubles to the municipalities. Most of the panel buildings or of these former state apartment blocks are still in the ownership of the state or of the municipality, and some of them have been destroyed. What we can do. So we also have some experience in Germany how to modify those typologies. And I think this is also something which needs to be discussed in Ukraine, not only about typology, but also about new ownerships, which might be also diversify the housing market in Ukraine. So for all of you who would like to get in contact with us, we are very happy to receive information, contributions from your side, and we are also now happy to answer your questions or to comment your comments on that.
Thank you, Philippe and Kate. Very inspiring, very difficult also to see some of those pictures again, although we see them every day so often. We have one question in the Q&A that I will just start answering, or not answering, saying out loud. It says, thank you so much for the presentation. What are the envelope dimensions, including the window to wall ratio, which are not, or which are maybe in line with today's trends? So I think behind the question lies the question, by rebuilding, reusing, should we also change maybe some of those issues according to nowadays trends?
This is a very important and very interesting question, and so I think what is important, or what would be the first issue to discuss would be, which series are we talking about? So that's the reason why we do this this investigation or the systematization, because the some series have the load-bearing walls inside the buildings. Some series have the load-bearing walls in the facade, and this is a big difference, because if I have the load-bearing panels in the facade, I cannot exchange and I cannot change them. That means for those series, and these are mainly series from the first generation, so very old Khrushchevkas. So that's the reason why most of those Khrushchevkas, for example, in Moscow or St. Petersburg, have been demolished, because there was not so much flexibility in do some modernization or some transformation. But when it comes to those series where the load-bearing walls are inside, and Kateryna showed some of these series, so it is possible just to change the facade. And you saw some of these damages what you showed in the very end. So the facade panels were demolished by rockets or by any other explosions, but the building was still standing. So that means if we talk about redesign or repairment, so those gaps of those buildings might be replaced with glazed facades. It would be possible, but again, saying everything based on the knowledge, which series are we talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of those panels are curtain panels, the facade ones. So they're depending on the series, they're load bearing or not. And I mean, I'm repeating what Philip said outright, but some of those Khrushchevkas were built in blocks, right? The block method, where let's say the entire kitchen is one block or the entire bathroom is one block, but some of them were not, and some of them are actually carcass buildings. So there are all kinds of things that can be done dependent on a specific type of series. I guess the one thing with wall, one thing that Philip didn't mention with the window and wall ratio, there's another important parameter, which is room depth. And that changed dependent on the code. So the room depth decreased sometime in the late 60s, actually in the mid 60s, because the assumption was that there's not enough light entering the rooms, and those are the smallest, some of the smallest Khrushchevka apartments. But then it was increasing after that, and so was the ratio of windows to walls. So there was a better natural light situation in those later series.
I have one related question myself for you, because I had it on my notes, and I think it's also about the facade. You explained that during the years the floor plans changed a little bit, and because of the people themselves, they had different ideas, different needs. And now what I hear is also people trying to make their own. So the floor plans were do-it-yourself, and now the facades, some people are doing their facades themselves because of the war. The facades have been broken out, and they are rebuilding them themselves, which some of the people say this is very dangerous. Some of the people say it's very brave, and some of the people will say, okay, it is interesting, but how do you do it in a proper way? Could you imagine you could also, your research could also give advice for this do-it-yourself rebuilding, at least during the war?
Well, I think, I guess I'll just start by saying that people used to touch up facades even before the war.
Yes, of course.
If you look at all of the external insulation, that was one of the funny little moments with all of the post-Soviet housing. A lot of Khrushchevkas had serious insulation problems. So people would just throw insulation on the facade outside of it. So I guess there's something to be said about, oh, and plus balconies. Of course, balconies were always modified by people themselves. So that was already happening. In terms of whether it's a good idea to rebuild yourself or not, I think we're entering the strange territory of legality and who does what, and who is going to be the institution that coordinates rebuilding. And, you know, to be honest, I'm very curious about that, but I don't quite know everything about all of the conversations that are happening right now. And I suspect that these are the conversations that are happening right now as to who finances rebuilding, who does the rebuilding, what are the limits. I'm sure Philip will have something to say about that too.
Yeah, we know that from other former Soviet republics, especially in Central Asia. Some examples from Uzbekistan come into my mind, where people just continued working on modifying on the facades, on the whole buildings. So that it means I also know some examples from Caucasus region. So we need to expect, or we can expect, that very soon, or it continues what already started, what Kateryna was just mentioning, with all the transformation of the balconies. So we will have an individualization, and we will have a kind of vernacular. We have a kind of vernacular architecture in future for all these facades. So we know that from all these low-rise standardized buildings. So after one generation, you cannot see a difference they're so much modified, you cannot identify or just still not recognize anymore that they used to be a standardized building in the beginning. So, and we can also expect that for these 11 floor buildings, but a big difference is so it must be reduced to small parts only. So it's because if you have a building block with 40 or 50 different owners, so somehow you need to find a common understanding of how the building is going to look like. And of course, everyone is using different panels or different parts for the balconies, but there must be a common understanding. On the other hand, so this kind of vernacular multi-floor buildings, so it's also showing the legal structure in those countries. And I think we also need to discuss legal issues, ownerships, this OSBBs in Ukraine, which have been founded in recent years. I think this is also something which is very, very important. But again, saying we are going to focus on architecture and construction, but we also raise our finger to say, please, those lawyers, those people who are working in the real estate market, share your information, share your knowledge, how to implement ideas of how to organize owners of a building, of an apartment building, where parts are demolished, not existing anymore, and how they can, as a community, rebuild this building. I just saw that there is a question in the chat. We are going to publish our research. Yes, this is one of our goals, and the more information we can collect. So
approximately when do you think
by spring next year? So it will take a while, but we depend also on contributions from the public, from the audience. So as soon as we are ready to share something, maybe before we go for a book publication, we can share some information also in the internet. We have plans to also continue giving lectures. So we are very happy to share. So this is not an academic research in the ivory tower. So this is really something we would like to contribute to the rebuilding of Ukraine.
And if I may add to that, there's, like we said in the very beginning, there's certain archives that we can access, like Kharkiv. But then places like Mariupol, if somebody has firsthand information on Mariupol, please share, because I don't think we would be able to really get a close look, sadly, other than from media.
To your question, actually, I think I have a part of the answer in my very close network. So Mariupol City Council is also still working on mapping the current situation of the whole city, including the questions that you asked about how much demolishing in which part of the town, and combinations of previous street view and current pictures, and these mappings could give quite a lot of information pretty soon, actually. Any more questions from the audience? If not, I will do one more myself and see, please see if there are some questions coming up. Concerning also these legal issues, because you made me think about it. When reuse of those materials is going to be provided or organized or facilitated, or at least thought about, do you have any experience in maybe in other countries how the ownership of the material that is going to be reused in another building, who owns this material actually, and can you do this? How does it work? Do we have experience?
I would say that this is a very unique and very new question. So when we talk about the examples of East Germany, I don't have the exact figures, but I would estimate more than 95% of the former socialist housing estates remained in the ownership of the state. We might find some interesting solutions or examples in the Baltic countries, part of the EU, formerly Soviet Union, and they have a different structure of ownership. So people own the apartment where they were registered, not in East Germany. When it comes to demolition and how to recycle those elements, I think you can find good examples in Germany. But again, saying those buildings were on the ownership of the state or of the municipality. So there was one owner. So when it comes to the demolishing of existing buildings in Ukraine, you have the legal problem that there are 40 or 50 owners who have to decide about demolishing of a building. And then I think this is a question for the lawyers. If you have a wall just in between two different apartments, who owns this wall physically? I don't know. I have no idea. I think this is a completely new question for those who are involved in all these legal issues when it comes to the housing.
I think one thing I can add to that, in that conversation on demolishing older series of Khrushchevkas that was happening before the war in 2021, at first it started with the assumption that 100% of the residents of a building have to give their approval for the building to be resettled and demolished. And then gradually it shifted to 75% of the residents of a building giving a permission for the building to be demolished and then resettled. So there were some legal precedents that are not exactly relevant, that are not 100% relevant to what's going on right now, but simply because that conversation already started in some way. I guess there were discussions happening. But yeah, absolutely, unlike in Germany, unlike even in, let's say, Czech Republic, where ownership is often by a stairwell, in the Ukrainian context, it's by apartment. I guess there's one more part to add to this question: who owns the infrastructure? And that is just another fascinating layer of all of the socialist housing. The infrastructure is completely shared, right? So let's say, what if the electrical substation for a building is destroyed? Who deals with that? Is that the city, or is that the OSBB, the dwellers that organized into an ownership cooperative that have to deal with that kind of reconstruction or demolition? So yeah, it's an interesting new terrain. And in a way, it's just mind-blowing for the entire post-Soviet world. Well, I mean, I don't know if the post-Soviet world exists anymore, or if we're in a new era, we might be in a new era. But when it comes to cities that were formerly Soviet cities, this is completely interesting new territory.
Thank you. We have a question from Anton Olenik, and he asks, do you believe that prefabricated construction will restart in Ukraine?
Definitely. So we can expect that the housing market needs any kind of production processes. So whether it is wooden modules, whether it is kirpich, whether it is prefabricated concrete elements, the big difference might be what we already highlighted. So we won't have type series which are repeated a dozen times, 100 times. So we might have a more individual type housing based on standardized elements. But I strongly believe that prefabricated concrete elements will be part of it. Whereas I have to say it might not become the majority, but it will be a part of it.
Kate?
If there's anything I have to add to.
No, but do you have the same opinion about the question about the
Yeah,
future?
very much so. I think that there is a future to prefabrication. I guess one thing to stay away from, in my opinion, since I'm in the US, I exist in the context of all the conversations about mass timber prefabrication, which is absolutely wonderful. However, there is a little bit of a scary assumption that will be easily possible in Ukraine. The problem is we don't have that much wood industry. We don't have forestry like the one that exists in the United States or elsewhere. So just all of these beautiful international fantasies of saying this is going to be all mass timber CLT panels, I don't know if that's a realistic answer at all.
I expect we will have a very diverse real estate market in Ukraine once Ukraine starts to diversify the ownerships and also the production of housing. So what we know in the moment, it is mainly organized by oligarch structures. So huge construction companies, huge development companies, they rule the market. But when it comes to a privatization, we can expect the units are going to be smaller, new typologies are going to induce to the market, and then we have a diversification of the whole real estate market. We cannot expect that within the next 5 years. I think this is something for the next 1 or even 2 generations, but we can expect a better diversification.
I think we have also okay, Kateryna, you have already answered on the chat to Stanislav Yev. Thank you so much. I think I want to give the last word to Philippe and Kate before I round up. We have no other questions than some questions of people who missed part of the conversation, and I think for the participants it's best to then review the video tomorrow when it's on YouTube So now, Philippe, Kate, is there anything you want to add at this moment for this presentation, or shall we just say we will meet each other in half a year to see the preliminary results?
So we are happy to share the preliminary results in half a year, and so we are also happy to share our knowledge, and we are happy to share what we are gathering here, and what the collected materials, the collected information. I think that's the most important task for today.
100% agree. We're happy to share, but also, I guess, looking at what exists in Ukraine is essential to not start fantasizing without that basis of what really is there. So that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you so much. Then the only thing that rests now for this meeting is thanking Philippe and Kate for this really wonderful explanation of some knowledge you already have and some new knowledge that you're definitely going to gain. I would need to say, unfortunately, we'll have to gain in the next few months. Thank you so much also, Elena, again, for the beautiful translation. I didn't hear anything because I was in the other channel, but thank you so much for your work again. Tomorrow there will be a version of this lecture on YouTube. It's actually two versions, one in Ukrainian and one in English, and please spread it around, or also look back to the last two lectures that we had, because this, as we know, is a series. I will send you here the YouTube channel. Then, last thing to say, Natalie Samovich, who used to live during her child time in Ukraine, but also lived in many other countries, as you can see, Portugal, Netherlands, Latvia, and she will give a lecture about resilient, distributed, and renewable systems, and its energy systems in this case. She's an energy expert, and she is part of the Ro3kvit coalition as well. 7th of July, again, 7 o'clock Kiev time. So 777, that is quite easy to remember. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for being with us. And I hope to see you in 2 weeks, and keep us informed about everything about mass housing, and send your information, please, to Philippe and Kate, or to Ro3kvit in general. Bye-bye. Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Fulco.